Frank Doyle has stood behind that counter for almost 30 years. He has held Rolex watches worth more than most houses. He has haggled over Civil War rifles, dinosaur bones, and a signed baseball that turned out to be a forgery so good it fooled 3 separate experts. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared him for the morning a stranger walked into Doyle's heritage pawn and exchange carrying a sword wrapped in faded black silk. What happened over the next 6 hours would bring a hardened, unshakable businessman to actual tears on camera, spark a call to federal authorities, and put a single object on the table that some experts believe could be worth $1.5 billion. This is the story of the Shogun Emperor's Katana, and how it nearly broke a pawn shop and a man in half. It started like any other Tuesday. The shop was loud, the way it always is, full of the clatter of gold scales, the buzz of the jewelry counter, and the low hum of haggling that never really stops from open to close. Customers drifted between glass cases full of watches, guitars, and old coins, none of them aware that the biggest single item in the shop's history was about to walk through the front door. Then the bell chimed, and a quiet, almost nervous man in his 60s stepped inside holding something long and narrow, cradled in both arms like it might shatter. He didn't say much. He just walked straight to the counter and set the bundle down gently, like he was setting down a sleeping child. Frank felt the room shift. He'd seen thousands of items cross that counter over 3 decades, from fine art to fighter jet parts, but something about the way this man moved, slow, protective, almost reverent, told him this one was different before the cloth was even untied. The regular noise of the shop seemed to fade into the background as the wrapped object settled on the glass. Frank has always said that the moment before an item is unwrapped tells him almost as much as the item itself. A confident seller unwraps quickly, eager to show off what they believe they've got. A nervous one takes their time, watching your face for a reaction before they've even finished. Walter Higgs was the second kind. His hands trembled slightly as he worked at the knots holding the black silk in place, and more than once he paused to glance up at Frank, as if checking whether he should keep going at all. When the silk finally came away, what lay on the counter was a katana. Not a replica, not a wall hanger from a costume shop, but a blade with a curve so clean and a polish so deep that the overhead lights seemed to bend around it. The seller, a man named Walter Higgs, claimed the sword had been signed by a legendary swordsmith whose name Frank didn't recognize, and whose reputation, if the story was true, placed this weapon in a category most collectors only dream about. Higgs said his grandfather brought it home from Japan in the chaos following World War II, tucked away in a duffel bag, and that it had sat in a cedar box in the family attic for over 70 years, untouched, unstudied, and completely unknown to the outside world. Frank did something the cameras almost never catch him doing. He didn't pick it up. He didn't turn it over to check for wear, or run his thumb along the spine the way he does with nearly everything else that lands in front of him. He just stood there, staring at the wrapping around the handle, his jaw tight. Anyone who knows antiques knows that with an item like this, the wrapping itself can hold more information than the blade, and the oils from a single careless hand can be the difference between a sword worth millions and a sword worth nothing. Frank called over his 2 most trusted staff, and even they went quiet. For the first time in years, nobody at that counter knew what to do next. Higgs kept talking, filling the silence the way nervous sellers do. He explained that after the war, entire estates in Japan were stripped bare. Families who had protected heirlooms for centuries were suddenly desperate, trading priceless treasures for food, for safe passage, for anything that would keep them alive through the occupation. Frank had heard stories like this before, and he knew that somewhere buried in that chaos, real treasures did slip through the cracks and end up in attics exactly like the one Higgs described. But he also knew that story alone was never enough. If this shop was going to survive the decision it was about to make, it needed proof, not folklore. Frank knew this decision was bigger than anything a single appraiser at the counter could handle. He also knew that in this business, the difference between a discovery and a disaster often comes down to who you call first and how quickly you do it. Rushing a sale on an item like this could bankrupt the shop in a single afternoon. Rushing to reject it could mean walking away from the single greatest find of his career. So he did what he always does when the stakes climb this high. He picked up the phone and started working his way through his short list of people he trusts more than his own gut. The first expert to walk through the door was a soft-spoken antiquities specialist named Dr. Elena Whitfield, who had spent over 20 years authenticating Japanese artifacts for auction houses on both coasts. She didn't rush. She circled the blade twice before she even touched it, examining the curvature, the temper line, the way light traveled along the edge. When she finally spoke, her voice had a weight to it that made the whole shop lean in. She said the proportions and the forging style were consistent with something far older than Higgs had guessed, possibly reaching back to the era of the earliest samurai lords, a period spanning roughly the 12th through 14th centuries. She pointed out delicate irregularities in the temper pattern that matched techniques largely lost to history, techniques so precise that modern smiths still struggle to fully replicate them. She noted a small etched panel near the base of the blade that might carry a maker's mark, but she refused to guess further. This, she said, needed a specialist who lived and breathed sword lineage, not just antiques in general. That specialist arrived 2 hours later. Professor Hideki Tanaka had spent his career studying the great sword-making schools of feudal Japan, and the moment he leaned over the blade with his loupe, the shop went completely silent. He traced the folding pattern along the steel for nearly 10 minutes without saying a word. When he finally straightened up, he told Frank that the craftsmanship strongly resembled one of the most revered smithing lineages in Japanese history, a school whose surviving works are counted, individually, by museums and royal collections. He was careful, almost painfully careful, to say this was not yet confirmation. A hidden signature, he explained, was the only thing that could truly settle the question, and that signature was buried inside the handle, a part of the sword far too delicate for a theorist like himself to safely remove. That job fell to the third expert, a soft-handed conservator named Sam Kessler, who had spent decades restoring fragile artifacts for museums that couldn't afford a single mistake. Removing an old handle wrong can crack a Tang, destroy a signature, or turn a masterpiece into scrap overnight, and everyone in that shop knew it. Frank watched, arms crossed, barely breathing, as Kessler worked with tools no larger than a dentist's pick, easing the grip free millimeter by millimeter. When the handle finally slid loose, there it was. A signature, faint but unmistakable, chiseled into the raw steel beneath. Professor Tanaka took one look and went pale. He said, almost in a whisper, that if this signature was genuine, this blade wasn't just rare, it was one of a small handful of surviving weapons tied directly to the ceremonial court of a ruling shogunate, the kind of piece that governments have been known to formally request the return of, the kind of piece that could trigger international attention the second word got out. But he also delivered the warning that every expert eventually gives on a find this big. A signature can be forged just as easily as a legend can be invented, and centuries of counterfeiters have proven far cleverer than anyone would like to admit. Full certainty would require laboratory testing overseas, a process that could take years and cost more than the shop could easily justify. It was at this point that something happened that nobody in that shop expected, least of all Frank himself. As Kessler laid the handle piece gently on a velvet cloth, Higgs, the seller, mentioned almost offhandedly that his grandfather had served with the 41st Infantry Division during the closing months of the war, stationed briefly outside Nagasaki before the surrender. Frank's expression changed instantly. His own grandfather had served in that exact division, in that exact region, during that exact window of time, a fact Frank had grown up hearing about at every family dinner for as long as he could remember. He asked Higgs for the name of the unit commander his grandfather had served under. Higgs answered, and Frank went completely still. It was the same name his own grandfather used to mention, the same commanding officer, the same unit, the same tiny corner of a collapsing empire. For a long moment, nobody at that counter said anything at all. The staff who had been watching quietly from the sidelines suddenly weren't sure where to look. Then Frank, a man who has sat across the table from thieves, con artists, and grieving families without so much as blinking, put both hands on the counter and lowered his head. When he looked back up, his eyes were wet. It wasn't the money. It wasn't the possibility of a life-changing find sitting 3 feet away from him. It was the sudden, overwhelming realization that two families who had never met, whose grandfathers had stood in the same ruined streets on opposite sides of a war, were now standing in the same room because of a sword that had somehow survived 80 years of history to end up back in front of him. He thought about his grandfather, a man who rarely spoke about the war and who died when Frank was still in his 20s, long before Frank ever thought to ask the questions he wishes he had asked. He thought about how many nights that old man must have spent in the same collapsing towns Higgs was now describing, walking past families losing everything they owned, maybe even walking past the very household this sword once belonged to. History rarely hands you a moment this direct. Usually it stays buried in photographs and half-remembered stories passed down over dinner tables. This time it had walked in through the front door wrapped in black silk. He apologized to the crew, wiped his face with the back of his hand, and admitted on camera that in almost 30 years behind that counter, nothing had ever hit him like this. Higgs, visibly moved himself, said he never expected the sword to mean anything to anyone beyond the price tag, and that watching Frank's reaction made the whole find feel different to him too, less like a payday and more like something worth protecting properly. When the conversation eventually turned back to value, the room needed a minute to recalibrate. Professor Tanaka explained that authenticated blades from this lineage have sold at auction for staggering sums, and that in the rarest cases, fully verified pieces tied to a documented shogunate court have been informally valued as high as $1.5 billion by private collectors, a number driven less by the steel itself and more by the historical and cultural weight attached to it. He was quick to caution that this number was speculative, resting entirely on the outcome of authentication testing that hadn't happened yet. Even so, the figure landed like a physical blow. Frank has appraised fortunes before. He had never heard a number like that spoken out loud in his own shop. He also understood, almost immediately, that a number that size comes with a weight of its own. An item this culturally significant could draw interest from cultural preservation offices, from foreign governments, from institutions that don't simply write a check and walk away. Owning something like this isn't the same as owning a rare coin or a vintage watch. It comes with years of legal review, potential repatriation claims, and a spotlight that most collectors aren't prepared to live under. Frank had watched other shops get buried under exactly this kind of attention before, chasing a headline number without thinking through what happens after the cameras stop rolling. He wasn't about to make that mistake with the biggest item to ever cross his counter. There was also the simple matter of trust. Even with 3 separate experts pointing toward something extraordinary, nobody in that room could say with total certainty what they were looking at until a laboratory thousands of miles away confirmed it. Frank had built his reputation over 30 years by never letting excitement get ahead of evidence, and this was not the moment to break that habit, no matter how tempting the number on the table happened to be. So instead of making an outright purchase, Frank proposed something he rarely offers, a formal partnership with Higgs, splitting the cost and the outcome of authentication, and sharing in whatever the sword is ultimately proven to be. Higgs, stunned by everything that had just unfolded, agreed on the spot. As of today, that sword sits in a climate-controlled case at the back of the shop, waiting on lab results from overseas, while Frank and Higgs, 2 men connected by grandfathers who never knew each other, wait together to find out exactly what they're holding. That wasn't the only time a sword nearly brought this shop to its knees. A little over a year earlier, one of Frank's longtime staff members, a good-natured man named Marcus who genuinely believed he knew more about Japanese weaponry than he actually did, made a decision that still gets brought up around the shop to this day. Frank was out running errands when a seller rushed in carrying 3 separate blades, visibly in a hurry, claiming he had somewhere else to be within the hour. Marcus, flattered by the pressure and confident in his own instincts, skipped every single one of the rules Frank had drilled into his staff for years. No phone call. No second opinion. Just a fast negotiation and a check written for just under $4,000. When Frank got back and heard what happened, he was livid. He joked, only half-jokingly, that if Marcus suddenly knew everything about samurai weapons, maybe the shop didn't need him standing behind the counter anymore. But underneath the joke was real concern, and Frank picked up the phone immediately and called in a specialist to figure out exactly how bad the damage was. The expert carefully dismantled each of the 3 swords to examine the hidden tang beneath each handle, the one place where a genuine maker's mark can never be faked convincingly for long. The first blade turned out to be the real prize of the bundle. The handle hadn't been disturbed in decades, and beneath it was a crisp, verified signature belonging to a well-documented 19th-century swordsmith whose work regularly commands strong prices at auction. That single sword alone was worth more than Marcus had paid for all 3 combined. The second sword told a stranger story. The steel itself dated back centuries, genuinely old and beautifully forged, but the signature carved into the Tang was an elaborate fake, added long after the blade was originally made. The expert explained that this wasn't some modern trick. Centuries ago, dishonest dealers would shave down the Tang of a lesser blade and carve in the signature of a famous master, hoping to fool wealthy buyers willing to pay a premium for a prestigious name. Even with the forged signature, the ancient steel itself still carried real value. The third sword was a mass-produced military blade from the Second World War, machine-forged and standard issue for officers. Common enough that thousands of American veterans brought identical pieces home as souvenirs. On its own it was worth only a few $100s, but combined with the other two, the specialist valued the entire bundle at roughly $13,000, more than 3 times what Marcus had impulsively paid. It was a lucky outcome born from a genuinely reckless decision, and Frank still reminds every new hire about it during training. Not every sword story ends with the shop coming out ahead in spirit, even when the numbers work out. Months later, a seller walked in with an unmounted blade wrapped loosely in cloth, along with a scrap of paper covered in symbols he couldn't read himself. He set it down and, without hesitation, announced he wanted $1 million for it. His reasoning traced back to a story he'd been repeating to himself for nearly a decade. He said a woman visiting his office years earlier had glanced at the symbols on the blade and told him they matched the name of a descendant of a famous historical warlord. He had since convinced himself that made the sword priceless, and after reading online that rare intact medieval-era swords could sell anywhere from $50,000 to several $1 million, he simply landed on a flat million as his number. Frank has a personal rule that the bigger the number a seller throws out, the faster he picks up the phone, and this case was no exception. The specialist arrived, opened the handle within minutes, and delivered a verdict that took less than 60 seconds to destroy the seller's decade-old fantasy. The characters on the Tang didn't match the name the seller had been told at all. They belonged to an entirely different, far less prestigious maker, one with no documented ties to any famous historical warlord whatsoever. Worse, the placement of the signature itself was wrong for the era the seller claimed the sword came from, since swords worn during that period were carried with the blade edge facing a specific direction, and true signatures from that time were always carved to face outward once worn. This one was carved on the opposite side entirely, a mistake no authentic craftsman from that century would have made. The final ruling was blunt. The blade was a mass-produced replica, likely manufactured for tourists roughly 15 years earlier, with acid etching used to fake the appearance of traditional folded steel. Instead of $1 million, the sword was worth somewhere between $50 and $200. The seller left with his wall hanger and nothing else, a reminder that a decade of believing a story doesn't make that story true. Swords aren't the only items that have tested Frank's judgment over the years. A few seasons back, a woman named Dana towed an entirely different kind of relic into the parking lot, something none of the staff had ever laid eyes on before in real life. A battered one-man personal submarine from the early 1980s, missing its viewing dome and half its internal components. The shop erupted into a mix of laughter and disbelief as the crew gathered around it, joking about exactly why anyone would try to sell a submarine in the middle of the desert. Dana just shrugged and said there were lakes nearby, which only made everyone laugh harder. Despite its rough condition, Frank saw a novelty item with real crowd appeal, and after a marine surveyor confirmed a pristine model could fetch up to $10,000, Frank talked Dana down from her asking price and picked up the beat-up vessel for $3,000 cash, certain he'd landed one of the strangest bargains of his career. The story didn't end there. Months later, after the episode featuring the submarine aired, an attorney in another state was watching from his living room when he froze mid-sentence. He recognized the exact scrapes, the exact hull markings, the exact build of the submarine on his screen. It belonged to a wealthy client of his, stolen straight off a private yacht 5 years earlier in what the client's family had always described as an impossible, almost cinematic theft. The attorney contacted the shop and local police within the hour, presenting original ownership records and a 5-year-old theft report that had gone cold. Investigators eventually confirmed that Dana had no idea the sub was stolen. She'd inherited it innocently as forgotten yard equipment from a friend. But under property law, that didn't matter. Frank was legally required to return it without compensation, and a retired truck driver was dispatched to haul the submarine off the lot for good, leaving Frank out $3,000 and one of the strangest, coolest items he'd ever bought. It's a case Frank still brings up when new hires ask why the shop insists on running a background check on serial numbers and ownership history before every major purchase, no matter how harmless or how eccentric the item looks sitting on the counter. Stolen property doesn't always look stolen. Sometimes it looks like scrap metal covered in dust in someone's backyard, and sometimes it looks like a piece of history that hasn't seen daylight in 70 years. Stories like these are exactly why Frank never takes a blade, or a submarine, or anything else at face value anymore, no matter how convincing the person standing across the counter sounds. Every single time, the truth is sitting quietly inside the steel itself, waiting for someone patient enough and careful enough to actually look. Sometimes that truth turns out to be nothing more than a clever forgery built to fool a hopeful buyer. And sometimes, on a rare Tuesday morning that nobody in that shop will ever forget, it turns out to be something that reaches all the way back across 80 years of history and hands two strangers a piece of their own families they never expected to find. So if you were standing behind that counter the moment that signature was uncovered, what would you have done? Would you have made the deal on the spot, or waited on months of testing before risking a single dollar? Drop your answer in the comments, and if this story pulled you in, make sure you're subscribed, because the next case waiting in the vault might be even bigger than this one.